My name is Elena Moore. I'm in my mid 30s now, and for most of my life, I've been known as the reasonable one, the calm sister, the one who doesn't make scenes, doesn't escalate, doesn't demand. If you asked people who knew me back then to describe me, they would probably say I was steady, reliable, maybe even a little forgettable. And for a long time, I thought that was a compliment. I worked, paid my bills, showed up to family gatherings on time, remembered birthdays, and smoothed over awkward moments. I learned early that being low maintenance made life easier for everyone else, especially with my sister. This story isn't about revenge, it's not about winning, and it's not about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic, explosive way. It's about something quieter than that. It's about what happens when blame is repeated so often that it starts to feel like truth, and what changes when you finally realize that blame isn't always about guilt. Sometimes it's about fear. For years, my sister blamed me for almost everything that went wrong around us. Not loudly, not cruelly, just consistently. If something was missing, it was probably my fault. If a plan failed, I should have known better. If tensions rose, it was because I was too sensitive or too passive. No one ever shouted, no one ever stepped in. It was all subtle enough to be dismissed, and constant enough to shape how I was seen. And I accepted it. Not because I believed I deserved it, but because I believed keeping the peace mattered more than correcting the record. I told myself it didn't hurt. I told myself I was being mature. I told myself that staying quiet was strength. This story follows the slow arc of that silence, from the years when I was invisible, to the moment I noticed something shift inside me, to the long, careful period where I stopped explaining myself and started paying attention. It's about observation, not confrontation, about preparation, not punishment, and about how the truth doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. What you'll hear is my side of events, told honestly and without embellishment. There are no heroes or villains here, just people protecting the roles that made them feel safe until those roles no longer worked. I won't exaggerate my pain, and I won't dramatize hers. I'll tell you what happened, what I understood too late, and why walking away calmly was the most decisive thing I ever did. If you've ever been the one who carried blame simply because you were quiet enough to hold it, if you've ever wondered why certain people need you to stay small so they can feel secure, then maybe this story will feel familiar. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever noticed who benefits when you're the one being blamed? To my family, I was the easy one, not the impressive one, not the dramatic one, just the one who didn't cause problems. At gatherings, my sister naturally took the center of the room. She had a way of speaking that drew attention, confident, expressive, always certain of her version of events. People listened when she talked. When I spoke, conversations often drifted elsewhere, not out of rudeness, but out of habit. I learned to pause mid-sentence when someone interrupted me, and eventually, I learned not to start at all. No one ever called me weak. They used kinder words, understanding, flexible, low maintenance. Those labels sounded generous, but they came with expectations. If plans changed at the last minute, I would adjust. If someone needed help, I would step in. If tension appeared, I would smooth it over. I became the buffer, the person who absorbed discomfort so others didn't have to. My sister relied on that more than anyone. If something slipped through the cracks, she'd say lightly, Elena probably handled it. If it wasn't handled, the implication hung there, quiet, unquestioned. I noticed that when things went right, the credit floated upward. When things went wrong, responsibility drifted sideways, toward me. What made it harder to recognize was how subtle it all was. There were no accusations delivered sharply enough to protest, just comments said with a shrug. Assumptions stated as fact. Small corrections were made on my behalf, even when I hadn't spoken incorrectly. And because I didn't object, the narrative settled. I told myself this was just how families worked. Those roles formed naturally, that someone had to be the steady one. I believed being reliable meant being silent. At work, it was similar. I wasn't the loudest in meetings, but my notes were thorough. My follow-ups were precise. When projects succeeded, leadership praised the team. When something failed quietly behind the scenes, I was asked, gently, what I could have done differently. I didn't argue. I reviewed my process. I fixed what needed fixing. Over time, people stopped asking for my opinion and started asking for my execution, and I let them. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't feel like neglect. It feels useful. You're needed, just not acknowledged. Trusted, but not credited. Included, but not considered. And because you're present everywhere, people assume you'll always be there. My sister assumed that most of all. She spoke for me often, explained my reactions before I could, laughed off moments that bothered me as Elena being sensitive. She framed my quietness as agreement, my patience as consent, and because I didn't correct her publicly, her version became the accepted one. I don't say this with anger now. At the time, I didn't even feel wronged. I felt assigned, like I had been placed into a role I hadn't auditioned for, but performed well enough that no one questioned it. What I didn't realize then was that being underestimated is a kind of visibility too. People watch you, just not closely. They assume you won't change, that you won't push back, that you'll continue to absorb, adjust, and accommodate. And I did for a long time. I was the sister who remembered details, the one who followed through, the one who didn't explode or demand explanations. I became predictable, safe, easy to overlook. What no one noticed, because no one thought to look, was that I was paying attention, not in a resentful way, in a quiet, observational way. I noticed patterns: who spoke, who was believed, who was corrected, who was excused. I noticed how blame moved through the room like air, invisible, but always settling in the same places. At the time, I didn't call it awareness, I called it maturity. But looking back, I understand something important. When people reduce you to a role, they stop seeing you as a variable. And when you stop being seen as a variable, they never anticipate your growth. That misunderstanding would eventually matter more than any argument ever could. The first moment I remember clearly wasn't dramatic. That's probably why it stayed with me. It happened during a small family dinner. Nothing formal, just the usual gathering where everyone brought something and sat wherever there was space. My sister was talking about a scheduling issue for an upcoming event. I had helped organize parts of it quietly, emailing people, confirming times, and double-checking details. When the conversation turned to a minor conflict in availability, she laughed and said, "Well, Elena must have missed that." She said it casually, almost playfully. A few people smiled, someone shrugged. The conversation moved on. I didn't say anything. Not because I agreed, but because correcting her felt unnecessary. I knew I hadn't missed it. I had the emails, I had the confirmations, but pulling out proof in that moment would have felt like making a scene over something small. And I had learned that scenes were far more costly than silence. Still, something about it stayed lodged in me. It wasn't the blame itself. It was how easily it landed, how naturally everyone accepted it. No one asked me, no one checked. The idea that I was at fault fit neatly into an existing outline of who I was to them: helpful, involved, but ultimately responsible if something slipped. After dinner, I went home and opened my laptop, not to prove anything, but to reassure myself. The emails were there, exactly as I remembered. I had flagged the issue weeks earlier. I had followed up twice. I sat there longer than I needed to, staring at the timestamps, feeling a quiet dissonance between what was true and what had been said. That was the first cut: small, clean, easy to dismiss. In the weeks that followed, I noticed more of them. Not accusations, assumptions. If my sister forgot something, she'd say, "I thought you were handling that." If plans changed unexpectedly, she'd remark, "I guess there was a miscommunication." The language was soft enough to avoid conflict, but directional enough to point responsibility away from her. And each time I stayed quiet. Part of me believed that speaking up would make me look defensive. Another part believed that the truth would eventually assert itself without my help. I trusted that people who mattered would see my consistency and understand. But consistency, I learned, can be interpreted in different ways. To me, it meant reliability. To others, it meant availability. And availability, when taken for granted, becomes expectation. What hurt wasn't that my sister blamed me once. It was that she didn't even seem to register that she was doing it. It was reflexive, almost protective, as if assigning fault to me kept her version of herself intact. I started noticing my own internal responses: how quickly I excused her, how often I rephrased events in my head to make her actions seem reasonable. I told myself she was under stress, that she didn't mean it, that correcting her would only create tension where none was needed. I didn't yet recognize that tension already existed. It just lived inside me. One afternoon, weeks later, someone casually referenced that dinner and repeated her comment, laughing. Yeah, Elena missed that detail, right? It was said lightly, but hearing it echoed back, detached from the original moment, made something settle in my chest. That's how stories solidify. Not through repetition by the person who started them, but through adoption by others. I smiled, I nodded, I let it pass. But that night, I wrote it down. Not emotionally, not dramatically, just a sentence in my notebook. Dinner, availability issue. Blame is assigned without checking. I didn't know why I wrote it. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't collecting ammunition. It just felt important to mark the moment, to acknowledge privately that something had crossed a line I couldn't quite name yet. That's the thing about the first small cut. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't demand attention. But once you notice it, you start to recognize the pattern of the blade. And you realize that what hurts most isn't the wound. It's how invisible it is to everyone else. Once something happens more than once, it starts to feel familiar. And familiarity has a way of dulling your instincts. After that dinner, the moments didn't stop. They blended into everyday life so seamlessly that if you tried to isolate any single one, it would seem insignificant. A comment here, an assumption there. A gentle correction was made on my behalf before I had finished a sentence, nothing sharp enough to object to without sounding overly sensitive. So I adapted. When my sister spoke over me, I paused. When she reframed my words, I let her. When responsibility drifted in my direction, I absorbed it. I told myself this was maturity, that choosing not to react was a sign of emotional intelligence. And for a while, that belief protected me. It gave me a narrative that made sense of the discomfort. I wasn't being dismissed, I was being understanding. I wasn't being overlooked, I was being generous. I wasn't being blamed, I was being trusted to handle things. This is how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, but through reinterpretation. At family events, people would ask my sister questions about plans I had organized. She would answer confidently, sometimes inaccurately, and I would quietly adjust later. I told myself that correcting her publicly would embarrass her, that it was kinder to fix things behind the scenes. Behind the scenes became my permanent location. I noticed how often people looked to her for confirmation, even when I was the one with the information. I noticed how she spoke in conclusions, while I spoke in considerations. Her certainty filled the room. My nuance disappeared into it, and still I stayed quiet. Part of it was fear. Not of her, but of what speaking up might change. Conflict has a way of rearranging relationships. Silence, on the other hand, preserves them, or so I thought. I also told myself that my sister needed this, that her confidence was fragile in ways I didn't fully understand, that correcting her might feel like undermining her. I took responsibility not just for logistics, but for her emotional comfort. Looking back, that was the unspoken agreement. I would carry the weight so she could remain unchallenged. There was one moment that stands out now, a conversation with a relative who praised my patience and said, "You're so good at letting things roll off your back." They meant it as admiration. I smiled and thanked them. But later, alone, I realized something unsettling. Nothing was rolling off. It was all staying with me. I was storing moments instead of addressing them, cataloging instead of confronting. I told myself I was letting go, but I was actually holding on, quietly, carefully, without letting anyone see the accumulation. My sister seemed increasingly comfortable speaking for both of us. She would say, "We decided," when I hadn't been consulted. She would say, "Elena's fine with it," before I had answered. And each time, the room accepted it without question. I began to understand something uncomfortable. My silence wasn't neutral, it was instructional. By not correcting the narrative, I was teaching people how to treat me. I was confirming their assumptions with my restraint. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to break the pattern. Not yet. I rationalized it in practical terms. Speaking up would require energy. It would invite explanations. It would shift the dynamic in unpredictable ways. Staying quiet was efficient, familiar, safe. But safety came at a cost I hadn't calculated. I started to feel a subtle separation between who I was internally and who I appeared to be externally. Inside, I was alert, analytical, deeply aware. Outside, I was agreeable, accommodating, unremarkable. That split is exhausting. I didn't feel angry. I felt reduced, flattened into a version of myself that was easier for others to manage. What I didn't realize then was that my sister had also grown used to this version of me. She relied on it, counted on it, and perhaps without consciously knowing it, needed it. Because as long as I stayed quiet, her version of reality remained intact. And so I stayed quiet. I normalized the dismissals. I explained them away. I convinced myself that this was just the shape of our relationship, and that changing it would only create unnecessary pain. What I didn't yet understand was that the pain was already there. It was just being carried by the one person who never complained about carrying anything. The realization didn't arrive as a sudden insight. It came gradually, through repetition, until the pattern became too clear to ignore. I wasn't just being overlooked. I had been assigned. Every group has roles that form quietly over time. The leader, the caretaker, the mediator, the one who handles things. And once those roles settle, people protect them, not maliciously, but instinctively. Roles keep systems stable. They prevent discomfort. They make interactions predictable. Mine was reliability without visibility. I was the person people leaned on, but didn't look at. The one whose presence was assumed, not acknowledged. If I didn't speak, it meant agreement. If I didn't object, it meant consent. If I handled something efficiently, it meant I would handle it again next time. My sister fit neatly into the complementary role. She was the voice, the face, the decision maker. Even when decisions were built on work I had done, the credit didn't feel stolen. It felt misplaced, like it had simply drifted where it naturally belonged. And that was the moment something in me shifted. Not anger, recognition. I began to see how often I was described in functional terms. She's good with details. She'll take care of it. Elena doesn't mind. Those statements weren't about who I was. They were about what I provided. No one asked what I wanted. Not because they didn't care, but because my role didn't require preferences. It required availability. I noticed how my sister spoke about me when I wasn't present. Always positively, always vaguely. I was supportive, helpful, great in the background. Compliments that sounded kind but subtly reinforced my place. Behind the background. The clarity came one evening when a plan changed at the last minute, and everyone looked to me, automatically, to absorb the inconvenience. I felt the familiar urge to adjust, to say yes, to make it work. Instead, I hesitated. Just for a second. That pause was enough to make the room uncomfortable. My sister filled it quickly. Elena's fine with it, she said, smiling. And in that moment, I understood something essential. My role didn't exist because I had chosen it. It existed because everyone else needed me to stay in it, including her. If I stepped out of line, if I asserted a boundary, corrected an assumption, or claimed space, the system would wobble. And systems resist wobbling. So they reinforce roles, gently, repeatedly, often without realizing it. I saw then how my sister's confidence was built, in part, on my quiet support. How my reliability made her certainty possible. How my silence allowed her narrative to remain uncontested. This wasn't about malice, it was about dependence, and that made it harder to confront. Because once you see that someone relies on you staying small, you're faced with a difficult truth. If you grow, they may feel threatened, even if you never intend to threaten them. I didn't say anything that night. I still wasn't ready. But internally, I stepped back and observed the structure we were standing in. The unspoken agreements, the expectations, the invisible labor. And I asked myself a question I had never asked before. Who would I be if I stopped performing this role? The answer wasn't clear, it was unsettling, but it was also strangely relieving. For the first time, I understood that my quietness had been useful to others, and that usefulness had slowly replaced my personhood in their eyes. I didn't want to be dramatic. I didn't want to accuse. I didn't want to dismantle anything out of spite. I just wanted to be seen as a full participant. And I realized that would require something far more disruptive than confrontation. It would require a change. Not a loud change, not a visible change, but internal change. The kind that shifts how you move, what you tolerate, and what you no longer carry for free. The role I had been assigned was reliable, useful, and inevitable. The next phase of my life would begin the moment I stopped accepting invisibility as the cost of belonging. The day something shifted wasn't marked by an argument or a revelation spoken out loud. No one raised their voice. No one stormed out. In fact, no one else noticed anything at all. That's what made it so important. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, light coming in through the window, my notebook open in front of me. I hadn't planned to write anything. I was just reviewing a few recent interactions, small moments that, on their own, meant nothing, but together formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I realized I was tired, not physically, emotionally. Tired of translating myself into something more convenient for others. Tired of preemptively minimizing my reactions. Tired of being the one who understood everyone else while remaining largely misunderstood. And in that quiet, unremarkable moment, I stopped asking why this kept happening. Instead, I asked something more honest. Why do I keep allowing it? That question felt different. It didn't blame my sister. It didn't blame my family. It didn't even blame me in a harsh way. It simply acknowledged my participation in the dynamic. I had been cooperating with my own reduction. Not consciously, not intentionally, but consistently. I saw how often I had chosen silence. Not because it was right, but because it was easier. How often I had mistaken emotional restraint for moral superiority. How frequently I had told myself I was being the bigger person when I was really just avoiding discomfort. That day, I decided to stop explaining myself internally. No more justifying others' behavior at my own expense. No more rehearsing arguments I would never make. No more quietly absorbing blame and calling it peace. I didn't plan a confrontation. I didn't draft a speech. I didn't set boundaries out loud. I made a much smaller, more dangerous decision. I decided to observe without participating. That meant no correcting, no fixing, no smoothing over, no volunteering to absorb tension before it reaches the surface. I would still be kind, still be present, but I would stop automatically stepping into the role that had been assigned to me. It felt subtle, but it was radical. The first test came sooner than I expected. A conversation where my sister once again summarized my position before I spoke. I felt the familiar urge to nod, to let it pass. This time I said nothing, not even agreement. I let the silence hang just long enough for someone to ask, "Is that right, Elena?" I answered calmly, briefly, without emotion. The room adjusted. It was almost imperceptible, but I felt it. A slight recalibration, a reminder that I was still there, that I still had a voice, even if I chose not to use it often. My sister noticed too. I saw it in the way she glanced at me, just for a second longer than usual. Not angry, curious. That curiosity told me something important. She had grown used to my predictability, and predictability is comforting until it disappears. I didn't push. I didn't correct past narratives. I didn't bring up old moments. I simply stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped being the buffer. Inside, something settled, a quiet resolve, not to punish, but to protect myself. I realized that I didn't need to convince anyone of my worth. I didn't need to rewrite the story. They believed. All I needed to do was stop reinforcing a version of myself that wasn't complete. That day marked the end of my unconscious participation, not the end of the story, but the beginning of my agency within it. And the most important part, no one could accuse me of changing, because I hadn't changed who I was. I had simply stopped disappearing. Once I stopped disappearing automatically, silence took on a different meaning. Before, it had been reflexive, a habit shaped by years of smoothing, fixing, and absorbing. Now, it was deliberate. I spoke when I had something to say. I stayed quiet when I didn't. Not to be agreeable, but to observe. And observation changes everything. Without my usual interventions, small cracks began to show. Plans weren't as seamless, details slipped, assumptions went uncorrected. It wasn't catastrophic, just noticeable enough to create mild discomfort. My sister filled the space the way she always had, confidently. She explained the delays, reframed outcomes, assigned reasons. What she didn't realize was that I was no longer quietly stabilizing those explanations behind the scenes. People started asking follow-up questions. Nothing accusatory, just clarifying. And each question required her to do something she hadn't had to do in a long time, account for details she had once passed off to me. I remained calm, present, neutral. My silence, in contrast to her certainty, created an imbalance she wasn't prepared for. Not because I challenged her, but because I no longer protected her from the natural consequences of incomplete narratives. She mistook this for weakness. I could tell by the way she spoke around me, slightly more directive, slightly more dismissive. She interrupted me more often, as if to reassert the dynamic she felt slipping. She made decisions faster and announced them louder. It didn't bother me. In fact, it clarified things. People often believe silence means compliance. They don't consider that it might mean calculation. I wasn't withdrawing emotionally. I was reallocating energy. The energy I once used to maintain harmony was now being used to track patterns, document inconsistencies, and understand the structure beneath our interactions. I started keeping more thorough notes, not just about events, but about responses. Who stepped in when I didn't? Who noticed my absence from the role I once filled? Who seemed unsettled by the shift? My sister noticed more than she let on. She began making comments like, "You've been quiet lately," framed as concern. I smiled and said I was just busy, which was true, just not in the way she assumed. There's something revealing about how people respond when you stop making things easy for them. Some adapt, some ask questions, some push harder. She pushed, not aggressively, subtly. She delegated more, assumed more, expected the old patterns to resume without discussion. Each time I didn't immediately comply, I saw a flicker of irritation pass over her face, quickly masked but present. That irritation wasn't about workload. It was about control. And that's when I understood something I hadn't before. The blame she had placed on me for years wasn't about my mistakes. It was about maintaining a hierarchy where she felt secure. Blame had been a tool, not a conscious one, but an effective one. As long as I was the quiet, capable, slightly at-fault sister, she didn't have to question her own position. My silence had once reinforced that hierarchy. Now my silence was exposing it. Others still underestimated me. They assumed I was disengaging, that I was tired, that I didn't care as much. That assumption worked in my favor. Because when people think you're passive, they stop monitoring you. They don't notice what you're learning, what you're recording, what you're preparing. I didn't feel powerful, I felt clear. Clear about the fact that confrontation would only harden defenses. It is clear that proving myself publicly would change nothing. Clear that the only meaningful shift would come from changing my position within the system, not arguing with it. Silence, chosen deliberately, became a form of boundary. Not a wall, a filter. I let information pass through me without reacting. I stopped offering explanations that no one had requested. I allowed others to experience the weight of their own assumptions. And slowly the dynamics began to tilt. My sister still spoke confidently, but now there was an edge to it, a slight urgency, a need to assert, because somewhere beneath her certainty, something had begun to feel unstable. And she didn't yet understand why. What they never noticed was how much I had always been paying attention. Even before I stopped stepping in, I had a habit of documenting things, not out of suspicion, but out of responsibility. Notes, timelines, confirmations. It was how I kept my work organized, how I reduced anxiety, how I made sure nothing fell apart. No one questioned it because it made me useful. When I became quiet by choice, that habit deepened. I started recording interactions more intentionally. Dates, decisions, who said what, and when. Not with the goal of confrontation, but with the clarity that comes from patterns laid out side by side. Patterns don't argue, they simply exist. I noticed how often my sister made definitive statements without checking details, how frequently she relied on others, especially me, to correct things later, how comfortable she was assigning responsibility downward while presenting confidence upward. I also noticed something else. When I stopped correcting her privately, she didn't improve her accuracy, she doubled down on certainty. That told me everything I needed to know. People who are open to growth adjust when the safety net disappears. People who rely on illusion try to reinforce it. I began learning more about the systems we were both operating within. Family dynamics, shared obligations, informal agreements that had never been written down but governed expectations. I revisited old messages, past plans, moments where accountability had been blurred by familiarity. What emerged wasn't a single betrayal or dramatic wrongdoing. It was something quieter, a consistent pattern of avoidance, projection, and dependency. My sister wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to avoid being seen as fallible, and blame had been the easiest place to put that discomfort. I positioned myself carefully. I stopped being the default contact for issues that weren't mine. I redirected questions back to their source. I asked clarifying questions instead of providing answers. Each move was small, reasonable, impossible to accuse. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, everything did. I also began to build something separate. Not a secret life, just an independent one. Decisions were made without consulting my sister. Plans formed without assuming her involvement. I reclaimed parts of myself that had been quietly outsourced to the role I played for others. She didn't notice at first. Why would she? I was still polite, still present, still calm. But the infrastructure that once supported her confidence was slowly being dismantled. I noticed how often she spoke about we when she meant I, how frequently she leaned on shared history to justify current authority, how uncomfortable she became when asked to define responsibilities clearly. Clarity threatens people who thrive in ambiguity. I didn't confront her with what I was learning. I didn't announce my observations. I didn't hint. I let time do its work. Because time, combined with documentation, reveals truth without noise. The most important thing I learned during this period wasn't about her, it was about me. I realized how much strength there is in restraint when it's chosen, not imposed, how powerful it is to step back without disappearing, how clarity sharpens when you stop reacting emotionally and start responding strategically. People often think preparation looks like action. Sometimes it looks like patience. And patience, when paired with intention, becomes leverage. By the time my sister sensed that something was different, it was already too late to reverse the dynamic. The version of me she relied on, the one who fixed quietly, absorbed blame, and stayed in the background, was no longer available. What stood in her place wasn't opposition. It was an absence. And absence is unsettling when someone has built their stability around your presence. She began asking more questions, seeking more confirmation. Her confidence gained a brittle edge. She didn't know it yet, but the blame she had placed on me for years was beginning to reflect back at her, not through accusation, but through exposure. And exposure doesn't require confrontation, it only requires light. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no satisfaction, no sense of victory. When it happened, I felt something much quieter. Clarity. It came as I was reviewing old records one evening. Messages, emails, notes I had kept without knowing why they might one day matter. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was simply aligning timelines, the way I had learned to do when something felt unresolved. And there it was. Not a secret in the dramatic sense, not a scandal, just a discrepancy that had been repeated often enough to become invisible. A pattern of decisions my sister had publicly claimed as collaborative, but which had been made unilaterally, often without full information, and sometimes in direct contradiction to what had been agreed upon earlier. On their own, each instance could be explained away: stress, forgetfulness, miscommunication. Together, they told a different story. They showed that my sister's confidence wasn't grounded in accuracy. It was grounded in an assumption, the assumption that someone else would absorb the consequences. Usually, that someone had been me. The leverage wasn't about exposing her mistakes. It was about understanding the structure she was standing on. I realized that many of the obligations she leaned on, emotional, logistical, even reputational, were informal, unwritten, maintained through habit rather than agreement, and habits can be changed. What made this a reveal was not the information itself, but the moment I understood its implications. I could step away, quietly, cleanly, without accusation, and if I did, the weight would not disappear. It would return to its rightful owner. That was the leverage, not power over her, but freedom for me. I sat with that understanding for a long time. I didn't feel excited. I felt sober. Because clarity carries responsibility. Once you see the truth of a dynamic, you can't unsee it, and you can't unknow the cost of inaction. I thought about confrontation, about laying out the evidence, explaining how I had felt, and asking for accountability. I imagined her reactions: defensiveness, justification, perhaps even tears. I saw how easily the conversation could turn into a debate about tone instead of substance. That wasn't what I wanted. I didn't need her to admit anything. I didn't need validation. I needed alignment between my values and my actions. And confrontation, I realized, would only pull me back into the role I was trying to leave: the one who explains, the one who proves, the one who carries the emotional labor of resolution. So I chose something else. I chose to act without announcing. The leverage I discovered wasn't something to be wielded, it was something to be respected. I adjusted my commitments, clarified responsibilities in writing, declined tasks that weren't mine to carry, redirected communications to appropriate parties. Each action was reasonable, each step was defensible. None of them required explanation. From the outside, it looked like nothing. From the inside, it was everything. My sister sensed the shift, but she couldn't locate it. She asked if everything was okay. I said yes, and meant it, because for the first time in a long while, I was okay with not being needed in the way she had come to expect. That unsettled her, not because she feared losing me emotionally, but because she feared losing the structure that had supported her certainty. And that's when it became clear. The blame she had placed on me all those years wasn't about my failures. It was about protecting herself from the possibility that she might be wrong. Seeing that didn't make me feel superior. It made me feel free. Because once you understand that someone's blame is rooted in fear, you stop internalizing it. You stop defending yourself. You simply step out of range. Clarity creates choice. Once I understood the structure of our dynamic, not just emotionally but practically, I found myself standing at a quiet crossroads. There was no deadline, no ultimatum, just a series of options, each leading to a different version of my future. I could continue as I was, remain calm, observant, and quietly resentful. Use what I knew to protect myself, but stay close enough to absorb the same patterns in new forms. That option promised familiarity. It also promised repetition. I could confront her, lay out the discrepancies, explain how the blame had affected me, ask for change. That path offered the possibility of repair, but only if she was willing to see herself clearly, and I had seen enough to know how unlikely that was. Confrontation would make me the problem again. Too sensitive, too intense, too dramatic for finally speaking up. Or I could do something else, something quieter, something irreversible. I could remove myself from the role entirely, not from her life, at least not immediately, but from the system that required me to stay small. I could step out of shared obligations, untangle responsibilities, redefine my presence so that it is optional, not assumed. This option didn't require permission. It required resolve. I spent days sitting with that choice, not emotionally, but ethically. I asked myself hard questions. Was this avoidance? Was it abandonment? Was I being unfair? The answers came slowly, but clearly. Avoidance would have meant staying silent and unchanged. Abandonment would have meant disappearing without care. What I was considering was neither. It was alignment. I realized that nothing I had done to maintain the relationship had been reciprocated in equal measure, that the peace I preserved came at my expense, and that choosing myself didn't require anyone else to lose. It only required me to stop overgiving. The irreversibility came not from the action itself, but from the internal commitment behind it. Once I chose to stop being the default, I couldn't pretend to see the cost of being it, so I decided. I would withdraw my labor before withdrawing my presence. I would stop carrying shared responsibilities that had never been clearly shared. I would formalize what I agreed to do and let everything else fall where it belonged. This wasn't a punishment, it was a correction. I started by updating my calendar, blocking time that had once been left open for emergencies that were never mine. I revised how I responded to requests. "I can't take that on" became a complete sentence. Not apologetic, not defensive, just factual. Each boundary I set felt small in the moment, but together, they formed a line I knew I wouldn't cross again. My sister reacted subtly. She tested the edges, made assumptions, spoke as if nothing had changed. Each time, I calmly redirected, clarified, declined. Her frustration grew, not because I was unkind, but because I was consistent. Consistency, when it no longer benefits someone, feels like resistance. The point of no return came when she tried to reassign responsibility in front of others, the way she always had. I didn't correct her. I didn't argue. Later, I sent a brief message clarifying my actual role. Clear, polite, documented. That was it. No accusations, no emotional appeal, but that message marked the end of something. From that point on, there was a record, a boundary in writing, a reality she could no longer reframe without contradicting herself. I felt no triumph. I felt settled, because I knew that whatever happened next, confusion, tension, distance, would not be reversible. Not because I wouldn't allow repair, but because I would never again agree to be miscast. The decision wasn't about her. It was about me choosing not to live in a role that required my own erasure. And once you make that choice, quietly and fully, there is no going back. After the decision, nothing exploded. That was the strange part. Life continued, conversations happened, plans were made. On the surface, everything looked the same, and that was intentional. I wasn't trying to send a message. I wasn't trying to provoke a reaction. I was simply moving differently. Quietly, I reviewed every commitment I had that involved my sister or our shared circle. I separated what was truly mine from what I had inherited through assumption. Where there was ambiguity, I clarified it. In writing, calmly, without emotion. I stopped being the intermediary. Messages that once passed through me were redirected to their rightful owners. Questions that weren't mine to answer were returned, politely, to the person responsible. None of this looked dramatic. In fact, it looked like professionalism. At work, I had learned that systems function best when responsibilities are clearly defined. I applied the same principle to my personal life, not as a statement, but as a practice. My sister didn't object, at least not directly. She adapted at first, took on more, spoke with more authority, filled gaps with confidence. But without my quiet corrections, small inconsistencies began to surface. Others noticed before she did. Someone followed up on a detail that hadn't been handled. Someone questioned a timeline. Someone asked why something had changed without notice. Each time, I stayed out of it. I let the system respond naturally. There's a particular discomfort that arises when someone realizes they've been standing on borrowed stability. It doesn't arrive as panic. It arrives as irritation, confusion, a sense that things are suddenly heavier than they used to be. My sister felt that weight, but she couldn't place it. She asked if I was upset. I said no. She asked if something was wrong. I said everything was fine. Both were true. What she didn't ask, and what I didn't volunteer, was whether I would continue to hold things together the way I always had. I also made changes she wouldn't see. I began investing more energy into my own life, not as an escape, but as a foundation. I built routines that didn't revolve around availability. I made plans that didn't require her input. I reclaimed mental space that had once been occupied by anticipating her needs. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of ownership. From the outside, I was still the calm one, the reasonable one, the sister who didn't make waves. That perception worked in my favor, because while no one was watching closely, the structure shifted. The absence of my invisible labor became noticeable only when it was already gone. My sister's confidence, once effortless, began to sound rehearsed. She spoke faster, explained more, asserted herself with a slight edge. People listened, but they also began to question. Not aggressively, just enough. She didn't blame me yet, not openly, because blaming me would have required acknowledging that I was no longer in the position she had assigned me, and that realization hadn't fully formed. I stayed patient. I knew this phase wasn't about results. It was about consistency, about letting reality unfold without interference. When you stop preventing consequences, you don't have to cause them. They arrive on their own, and I was prepared to let them. Consequences rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, disguised as inconvenience. At first, it was small things, a plan that didn't quite come together, a detail that was overlooked, a message that went unanswered longer than expected. Nothing serious enough to confront, but enough to create a low hum of confusion. People began feeling it before they understood it. Someone remarked that things felt less organized lately. Another joked that coordination seemed harder than it used to be. These comments floated through conversations without landing anywhere specific. I stayed neutral. My sister heard them too. I saw the way her posture stiffened slightly when someone asked a follow-up question she wasn't prepared for. The way she smiled was a fraction longer than necessary before answering. The way she filled the silence with explanation. She was still being listened to, but not with the same unquestioning ease. What she didn't realize was that this wasn't a sudden failure on her part. It was the absence of correction. For years, I had smoothed edges quietly, clarified misunderstandings, redirected assumptions before they hardened into problems. Without that invisible maintenance, reality behaved differently. And reality, unlike people, doesn't soften its feedback. I noticed how often others began turning to her for answers I used to provide. The difference was that now, those answers were expected to be complete, accurate, accountable. She grew defensive without knowing why. There was a moment that stayed with me, a conversation where someone questioned a decision she had made publicly. Not harshly, just a simple request for clarification. She responded quickly and confidently, but her explanation contradicted something she had said earlier. The room went quiet, not accusatory, just attentive. She laughed it off, adjusted her answer, and moved on. But the shift had happened, a small fracture in perception. No one blamed her outright. They just stopped assuming. An assumption, I realized, had been her greatest shield. The consequences weren't dramatic losses. They were subtle recalibrations, people double-checking, asking for confirmation, looping in others. Authority erodes not when it's challenged, but when it's no longer taken for granted. I remained where I always was, present, calm, unreactive. Some people noticed my continued steadiness and began to approach me differently, asking my opinion directly, seeking my input quietly, not because I demanded it, but because the contrast had become visible. My sister noticed that too. She started watching me more closely. measuring my responses, interpreting my calm as detachment, my neutrality as judgment. She grew uneasy, though she hadn't yet identified the source of that feeling. And that's when the blame returned. Not overtly, not cruelly, just in small, familiar ways, comments about my pulling back. Suggestions that things had changed because I was less involved. She was trying to restore the old logic. If something feels wrong, it must be Elena's absence. But this time, the blame didn't land the way it used to. Because the system had changed. I hadn't withdrawn emotionally, I hadn't disengaged. I had simply stopped absorbing responsibility that wasn't mine. And that distinction mattered. Others could see that I was still kind, still responsive, still cooperative, within clearly defined bounds. The narrative that I was the problem no longer fit as cleanly as it once had. The loss people felt wasn't my presence. It was my labor. And that's a hard thing to grieve openly, because acknowledging it requires admitting how much you depended on it. My sister was beginning to realize that something had shifted, not just in me, but around her, that the ease she once moved through situations with had been supported by something she could no longer access. And the most unsettling part? No one had taken anything from her. I had simply stopped giving it away. The moment my sister realized something was truly wrong didn't come during a confrontation. It came during the silence, not the strategic kind I had chosen, but the hollow kind that follows when familiar support doesn't appear where it always has. When the systems you rely on fail quietly, you don't panic at first. You assume there's been a delay, a misunderstanding, something temporary. She reached out more often, not directly for help, not yet, but for reassurance. Casual questions, light check-ins, invitations framed as concern. Everything okay? You've been busy lately. We should catch up. I responded politely, warmly, briefly. What I didn't do was resume my old role. That's when confusion turned into anxiety. She began revisiting old conversations, rephrasing them, searching for a moment where she might have misstepped. I could hear it in the way she spoke, slightly slower, more careful. She was trying to locate the fracture. But fractures that form from long-term imbalance don't have a single origin point. You can't apologize your way out of them. She offered small gestures, compliments, acknowledgments that would have meant something once. She even said, "I really appreciate everything you do." I thanked her, and I kept my boundaries. That was when the panic surfaced. Not dramatic panic, not tears or anger, but a subtle urgency. She began inserting herself back into spaces I had stepped away from, attempting to reclaim familiarity. She assumed closeness where I had redefined distance. Each attempt felt slightly out of sync, because she was responding to a version of me that no longer existed. I realized then that even if she wanted to fix things, truly fix them, she didn't yet understand what had been broken. She thought the issue was emotional withdrawal, hurt feelings, distance. It wasn't. The issue was structural, and structural issues can't be resolved with sentiment. She tried to pull me into a conversation one evening, hinting that something felt off between us. She said she missed how close we used to be, how we worked so well together. I listened. Then I said something simple. I'm just being more intentional about what I take on. No accusation, no history lesson, no explanation beyond that. She nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. Because intention had never been part of the equation before. Habit had. The regret came next, not expressed openly, but visible in the way she hesitated before speaking, in the way she softened her tone, in the way she tried, belatedly, to include me as an equal rather than a support. But by then, the dynamic had already shifted. You can't suddenly respect boundaries you never acknowledged existed. You can't rebuild trust without first recognizing how it was eroded, and she wasn't ready to do that. I felt no satisfaction watching her struggle, only a quiet sadness, because I could see that she genuinely didn't know how much she had relied on me staying small. And I understood something painful. Even if she apologized perfectly, nothing could return us to the way things were. Because the way things were required my erasure. Once you reclaim yourself, you can't unsee the cost of giving yourself away. She was trying to fix something without naming it, to restore a balance without understanding that the balance had always been unequal. And I wasn't willing to return to that. So I stayed steady, kind, clear, and I let her sit with the discomfort. Not as punishment, as a consequence. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances, no moment where years of silence suddenly poured out in a rush of emotion. It happened quietly, almost gently, on an ordinary afternoon when my sister asked if we could talk. We sat across from each other in a neutral space, no audience, no urgency. She looked tired, not overwhelmed, just worn down in a way that comes from trying to regain control without knowing where it slipped away. She started carefully. "I feel like you've pulled back," she said, "and I don't know why." I let the silence sit for a moment, not to punish her, but to make sure I answered honestly. "I have," I said, "but not from you, from the role I was playing." She frowned slightly, as if searching for something familiar to hold on to. "I don't understand." And I believed her. So I didn't explain everything. I didn't recount every small cut, every assumption, every moment of misplaced blame. That kind of explanation turns into a negotiation, and I wasn't negotiating my clarity. I realized I was taking responsibility for things that weren't actually mine, I said, and I needed to stop doing that. She was quiet. Then defensively, "I never asked you to do that." "I know," I replied. "That's kind of the point." That was the closest we came to tension. She looked at me, really looked, as if trying to reconcile the version of me she had known with the one sitting in front of her. I wasn't angry. I wasn't cold. I wasn't emotional. I was grounded. She tried once more. "If I made you feel blamed or unappreciated, I'm sorry." It was a careful apology, conditional, still framed around feelings, not behavior. I accepted it anyway. "Thank you," I said. "I'm not looking to rehash the past. I just needed things to change." "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means I'll be clear about what I can and can't do," I said, "and I won't take on things just to keep things smooth." She nodded slowly. There was no resolution, no closure that wrapped everything neatly, just an understanding, partial, imperfect, that something fundamental had shifted. And that was enough. What mattered wasn't whether she fully understood. It was that I had said what I needed to say without shrinking or inflating myself to be heard. When the conversation ended, there was an awkward pause. She reached for familiarity, a joke, a shared reference, and I met her there gently, without stepping back into old patterns. We parted politely. No doors slammed, no bridges burned. But something irreversible had been acknowledged. For the first time, I wasn't explaining myself to be understood. I was stating my position to be respected. And whether or not she was ready for that respect was no longer my responsibility. Who I am now looks very similar to who I was before, at least on the surface. I'm still calm, still observant, still someone who values thoughtfulness over noise. I didn't become louder, sharper, or harder. I didn't reinvent myself into a version that demanded attention. What changed wasn't my personality. It was my position. I no longer live inside assumptions that aren't mine. I no longer carry responsibility by default. I no longer confuse being needed with being valued. The difference shows up in small, ordinary ways. I answer questions directly instead of preemptively. I let pauses exist without rushing to fill them. I say no without over-explaining, and yes without resentment. People respond differently now. Some adjusted easily. They welcomed the clarity. They respected the boundaries without drama. Others seemed unsettled, unsure of how to interact without the familiar version of me smoothing the edges. That discomfort told me more than any argument ever could. My relationship with my sister is quieter, not distant, but redefined. She is more careful with her words now, more precise. She asks instead of assuming. Sometimes she still slips into old habits, and when she does, I don't correct her publicly or privately unless it directly involves me. I simply don't step in, and she feels that absence, not as rejection, but as a recalibration she's still learning to navigate. I don't hold resentment toward her. In fact, I understand her more clearly than I ever did when I was trying to protect her from discomfort. I see now how fear shaped her behavior. Fear of being wrong, of losing authority, of being seen as less capable than she wanted to be. That fear doesn't excuse the blame she placed on me, but it explains it, and understanding has given me peace. I also see myself more clearly. I recognize how my own avoidance of conflict made me an easy container for other people's uncertainty, how my silence, once mistaken for strength, became a hiding place. True strength, I've learned, isn't about enduring quietly. It's about choosing consciously. I didn't need to punish my sister to reclaim myself. I didn't need to expose her or humiliate her or win some moral victory. I needed to stop participating in a system that required my silence to function. And I did. There are moments when I miss the ease of being underestimated. There's a strange comfort in invisibility, a freedom from expectation. But I don't miss the cost. Because now, when I offer something, it's given freely. When I stay quiet, it's because I have nothing to add, not because I'm afraid to speak. When I help, it's acknowledged. And when I'm blamed, it doesn't stick because I know who I am. I'm not the role I was assigned. I'm not the buffer, the background, the quiet fixer of other people's discomfort. I'm a whole person with limits and preferences and a voice that doesn't need to be loud to be firm. This version of me isn't dramatic. She's steady, and that steadiness doesn't come from endurance. It comes from alignment. There's a quiet lesson at the end of this story, one that took me years to understand, and even longer to accept. Blame is rarely about the person it lands on. More often, it's about the person who can't afford to look too closely at themselves. For a long time, I believed that staying calm, staying useful, and staying silent were signs of maturity. I thought that if I absorbed enough responsibility, things would eventually even out, that people would notice, that fairness would emerge on its own. It doesn't. Systems don't correct themselves just because one person is patient. They continue in the direction they're supported. And for years, I supported a system that depended on my quiet compliance. When my sister blamed me, it wasn't because I was incapable. It was because my silence made me safe. I was a place where uncertainty could land without resistance, a mirror that didn't reflect her fear back at her. Once I understood that, the blame lost its power. Not because I fought it, but because I stopped carrying it. That's the part people often misunderstand. Stepping away doesn't have to be loud. You don't have to announce your boundaries, expose anyone, or demand accountability in dramatic ways. Sometimes the most decisive shift happens when you quietly remove yourself from a role that was never yours to begin with. And when you do, something revealing happens. The people who relied on you staying small feel it first. They may call it distance, or change, or coldness. But what they're really feeling is the loss of access to your labor, your emotional regulation, your willingness to absorb discomfort on their behalf. That loss can look like fear, and fear often tries to disguise itself as blame. I don't regret the silence I chose at the end. It wasn't avoidance, it was discernment. I learned that you don't owe everyone an explanation for your growth. You don't need permission to become more precise about your life. And you don't need to prove your worth to someone who benefited from you doubting it. If you're listening to this and seeing yourself in any part of my story, the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who gets blamed because you're the easiest place to put it, I want you to know something. You're not weak for staying calm. You're not wrong for wanting peace. But peace that requires your erasure is not peace. It's a postponement. The moment you stop absorbing what isn't yours, you'll learn something important about the people around you and about yourself. And that knowledge, once gained, is gentle but irreversible. So I'll leave you with one question, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to reflect. When blame keeps finding you, have you ever paused to ask whose fear it might be protecting?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.